Final Fantasy VII was a historic achievement. The game not only popularized the JRPG in English-speaking territories, it made the Sony PlayStation and its 3D polygons important for the industry's future. In this, the third and final part of my mini retrospective on the game, we'll cover how Square created FF7 and how it went on to change the world. In 1994, Square established a relationship with the key player in the story of how real-time 3D became the industry standard, a company named Silicon Graphics. Silicon Graphics was formed around a new method of producing 3D graphics called the geometry engine. This specialized piece of hardware allowed imaging of 3D geometrical shapes, which had the potential to dramatically reshape the games industry. As a company known for its large 2D RPGs, Square, like many others at the time, had a lot of learning and hiring to do with this new Silicon Graphics technology. Even before deciding on which upcoming console, the N64 or the PSX, that the next Final Fantasy would debut on, Square got to work on a basic tech demo, using a Silicon Graphics workstation. Square created a 3D demo based on characters in combat from their most recent Final Fantasy FF6. Square hoped to show the demo at the upcoming industry conference in Los Angeles for computer graphics and interactive techniques known as SIGGRAPH. And looking at it today, the demo makes clear just how huge of a change the jump was going to represent from 2D to 3. The fundamentals of interactivity were changing, very much in flux.
At that time, actually, the most of the game is done in a 2D because of that there is no 3D game machine there. But I can expect that it's move on to the 3D sometime soon. Actually, the Square plan to develop the Final Fantasy 3D game for the Nintendo machine. Then initially, we work on some emulator on it, but the emulator is not so ready to use. And also, actually, the 3D game is no one experienced before. Then we don't know what we can do with that. Then we should do some trial to see what we can do with the 3D technology. So we don't set any limitation of the resources, like a memory or a processor or others.
The demo required the player to indicate their action by drawing a symbol on screen. When Square showed it at SIGGRAPH, it was a standout, if not a perplexing, presentation for those who attended. At this time, the earliest attempts at creating games in 3D tried to achieve with computer graphics an almost photorealistic effect. Square, meanwhile, starting with this demo, were already going against the trend by using the new technology to create visuals that were more like anime. This stylized approach would make FF7 an icon at the crux of a newfound international interest in specifically Japanese styles of visual design, thanks to an anime boom in the West. After an earlier aborted attempt to create FF7 as a Super Famicom title, and completion of one of that era's greatest JRPGs, Chrono Trigger, Square now had to decide on their upcoming entry into the world of 3D development's platform. It would be impossible to do this topic justice without mentioning a key player, Nintendo. For most of Square's history up to the mid-90s, the company made games for Nintendo consoles. It would be FF7's development that would open a rift between the two companies, which would last for years. For years, JRPGs had failed to succeed in the West, particularly in the US. Square even went so far as to make a dumbed-down Final Fantasy that would be more accessible, called in the States Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, and in Japan Final Fantasy USA. But this failed too. Square had already been struggling with Nintendo over hardware issues and their apparent lack of respect for some time. From titles like Romancing Saga to Secret of Mana, Square kept running into technical problems and experiencing a lack of support. Nintendo withheld access to their new 12-megabyte game cartridge for the sake of Enix's Dragon Quest V, took credit for Super Mario RPG, and, because of their falling out with Sony that would lead to the creation of the PlayStation as a rival machine, when Nintendo tried to go behind Sony's back and have their new console's CD-ROM technology developed by the American company Philips, Secret of Mana by Square had to be retrofitted onto a standard Super Famicom cartridge, despite it having been designed for CD-ROM. Not to mention that by this time, Square had already spent millions of yen on R&D for Final Fantasy VII as a kind of game that, on a 32-megabyte cartridge like the kind Nintendo now said that their new console would use, would be impossible. Prior to Final Fantasy VII, graphics weren't really considered all that crucial for RPGs, but Square correctly believed that focusing on the visuals while somewhat simplifying the core RPG mechanics would be a winning combination for Western markets. Though the N64 and the PSX would both use Silicon Graphics technology, the N64 wasn't suitable for the heavy on cutscenes and high polygon count game idea Square had in mind. And unlike Nintendo, who were more loyal and involved with their in-house studios than third or second-party ones like Square, Sony was completely revolutionizing the relationship between developers and publishers. Sony wanted to work together closely with practically all of the studios making games for their console, and that appealed to Square, especially given that Sony was willing to help pay for marketing. After experimenting with prototypes created for both systems, in the end, the affordability, better visuals, and bigger potential offered by Sony and their CD-ROM-based console, the PlayStation, won out. The relationship between Square and Nintendo, sadly, would not recover for about 10 years, especially once Square began to convince other studios, like Enix, to jump onto the PlayStation as well. With the platform decided, Square got to work forming one of the biggest and most expensive dev teams for the time in history. Stunningly, the time for development would be limited to just over a single year. This meant growing a team that started with about 30 or 40 members to 150, not to mention purchasing a ton of Silicon Graphics workstations. The game would be created without any limitations by using these workstations. Because Square knew going in that FF7 would be a 3D game, some of the earliest work involved drafting detailed designs. The developers even used a Hollywood and anime technique of storyboarding, especially for the summon sequences. One of the first elements to be set into place was how the camera would move around dynamically and responsively to player input during battles. At first, Hironobu Sakaguchi was so thrown out of his element from the jump into 3D that he found it, quote, difficult even in my head to picture what the battle scenes should look like, end quote. That's how cutting-edge FF7 would prove to be. Using the next-gen workstations from Silicon Graphics enabled the creation of game assets that, in theory, could be imported onto any system, but having already chosen the PSX for the platform, Square also realized it needed to find a way to cut down on the lengthy rendering cycle for CG if they wanted the game to be finished within a time frame of just a little over 1 year. And they do this by utilizing the PlayStation's abilities to use both pre-rendered CG and 3D rendered in real time. The decision to use such a short dev cycle and top-of-the-line technology both ensured that FF7 would be a cutting-edge release. Arguably, for the very first time, the games industry was beginning to enter a true graphical arms race, far surpassing, with 3D, the silly rivalry that had recently sprung up between the Super Famicom and the Sega Genesis. The extensive use of 3D polygons and combination of real-time with pre-rendered visuals made FF7 something of an icon for this wider medium evolution. It made also clear that video games of the future would be full-blown projects of CAD or computer-assisted design, thereby blurring some of the lines separating games from Hollywood and its use of CGI. And the game's use of perspective and camera angles introduced in this very high-profile release the cinematic visual language into gaming maybe for the very first time. Though FF7 would not be history's first 3D game by a long shot, it may have been among the first to represent the first wave of this emerging paradigm in the games industry of a playable movie. But that all would depend on getting the models and animations created on the Silicon Graphics workstations onto the PSX. In this, Square was perhaps the first company to really struggle with a problem that in the coming age in the late 90s of 3D games on the PlayStation would prove ubiquitous. It was only thanks to Sony, however reluctantly, agreeing to give the devs access to the hardware code directly that FF7 was workable at all. Using cutting-edge technology lured lots of talent to work for Square at a very competitive time for the Japanese games industry. And as the scale of the project grew, so too did Square's ambitions for making FF7 their very first true international hit game. Sakaguchi had led the Final Fantasy series for years, but with 7, he ceded some control to a dev with former ambitions to become a filmmaker, Yoshinori Kitase, and an employee of the company who had actually begun working for Square as a game tester, Tetsuya Nomura. Kitase understood the cinematic language enough to use camera angles in a bold new way. One reason the game looked so fantastic for the era came down to character designer Tetsuya Nomura, whose commitment and attention to detail meant slaving away on minutiae like eyelids and eye shape for a very long time. The result was characters that looked expressive and detailed even in chibi or super deformed form. The importance of how characters move is also easy to understate. It was thanks to the perfectionism of Nomura that each character in FF7 expresses a unique persona through their gestures, expressions, and subtle differences in animation. Unlike prior Final Fantasies, which had relied on the designs of artist Yoshitaka Amano, it was thanks to Nomura's background as a manga artist that character designs would correspond so well to 3D. The more realistic proportions seen during combat, meanwhile, were a practical necessity for animation. To develop Final Fantasy VII as efficiently as possible, Square would organize an engine and their devs into modules. Each would only handle programming and art assets for their specific unit. These were world map, field, menu, battle, and minigame, and a specific flow between them existed hierarchically, with the field module given primacy. And then there was the added degree of fidelity offered by the PlayStation's CD-ROMs in terms of sound. No longer relegated to 8-bit compositions, series composer Nobuo Uematsu was given free rein over the game's score. He sought to recreate some of the operatic grandeur and complexity from 60s and 70s era progressive rock, which led to such unique tracks as One-Winged Angel and of course the main game theme. Though the PSX's CD-ROM technology could have allowed for pre-recorded music, Nobuo Uematsu wanted to lessen the load times accessing this pre-recorded soundtrack would have taken. So by sacrificing some of the audio fidelity, the gameplay experience and general immersion improved greatly. It was when Square completed one of the earliest images from the game, Cloud, posing beneath the Shinra reactor, that the writers came up with the concept of his false identity. But this was far easier to work into the game than the addition of new party members in the middle of its development, like Red 13, Yuffie, and Vincent. Animating the four-legged Red, for example, made his character modeling difficult, while time was so short that when creating Yuffie and Vincent, the team considered cutting both entirely. Instead, these party members were made optional, secret characters who, despite this fact, still wound up surprisingly fleshed out. Actually, even major characters like Tifa and Sephiroth weren't added until late in development. Due to the huge increase in CG, Square also hired outside the industry, calling on veterans of 3D animation from lustrous other companies like Digital Domain and LucasArts Industrial Light and Magic. In order to work with talent from those Western companies that I mentioned, like Industrial Light and Magic, Square's development team would spread across the Pacific to Honolulu, Hawaii, where the game's pre-rendered cinematics would be made. Square would also stagger the development and release of the next 3 Final Fantasies, using this new Honolulu facility to do so. But one aspect to FF7 that's easy to overlook today is how difficult it was to get models that were created on those workstations with their high polygon counts down low enough to fit into the actual game. This went not only for render models, but field backgrounds too. Whereas prior FF games had their maps stitched together using discrete sprites, town backgrounds in FF7 were constructed whole cloth as single images. This allowed for a level of creativity and uniqueness from background to background that, despite their still limited use of 2D perspective, still looked next-gen compared to prior titles in the series. Art director Yusuke Naora gave these backgrounds what he called a lived-in feel, which really brought the towns and most of all the giant city Midgar to life. Though most of the time character models would be animated in chibi form for big scenes like the motorcycle escape, Square used CG to portray, for the first time in the series, fully realized character designs in cutscenes. For the important relationship between Cloud and Sephiroth, meanwhile, Tetsuya Nomura had in mind the rivalry between the 2 legendary samurai from Japan, Musashi Miyamoto and Sasaki Kojiro. We can see this influence just by comparing their final battle to the famous statue of the 2 samurai in Ganryujima, Japan. Though the writing would retain some of the broadness of a cartoon, elements like Cloud's love triangle and Aerith's death, and the very ambiguous ending, all brought the medium into a more mature and pseudo-realistic dimension than ever before. Above all else, the way Aerith dies was treated with an unusual degree of realism. The team wanted no warning, and no recognizable tropes like using her death to propel the player's fight against evil further. Instead, her death got written as a heartfelt tragedy without sensationalism, which gave her life more meaning. Her dying helped fulfill the wider scenario, given by co-writer Kazushige Nojima as a story of life cycling through the planet. Suddenly, the story-heavy nature of RPGs no longer made them feel like reading a book or visual novel. With FF7, the genre of JRPGs, but also the entire wider Japanese games industry, would soon gain a degree of respectability as a medium of art and entertainment, even of culture, around the world, a degree it arguably had lacked before. Despite only having about a year, Square pulled off the minor miracle of creating, in FF7, a game that would truly alter the course of video gaming history. But the main way Sony and Square broke the JRPG curse in America was not only through better visuals and more accessible mechanics, it was through that most American art form, advertising. Sony paid a staggering $100 million for marketing this game, which bought primetime TV commercials, magazine coverage, a promo campaign with Pepsi, and more. PlayStations came with the demo for the game, and Square even created a player hotline for gameplay tips. Final Fantasy VII was, as a result, a major pop cultural event, even in America. It was the start of a new paradigm in this industry, which brought the Hollywood ideal to the fore and finally made the JRPG a worldwide success. With its 1997 release, FF7 changed both video games as an industry and as a medium forever. Its use of Hollywood techniques and influence that it drew from games made both by the East and West led to a title with international appeal. After a number of spin-offs and related projects across 20 years, the game, as you likely know, has been recently reincarnated with the first of a multi-part remake. Who knows if it can, like its ancestor, stand the test of time. Whatever the outcome, the original FF7's influence lives on even to the present day. Until next time, boss.